This is Josh Schneider. You know the routine, so I will invite Michael Weeks up and turn the floor over to him.
First of all, I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank Kathleen and Brian for helping to put everything together, to the grad students who shuttle us around and done a lot of the behind-the-scenes work to make so much as possible. I want to thank Sterling for taking time to comment. And I just want to tell you, when I looked at the pitch for this conference, I saw water as one of the needs. But I'm the lone water guy. So water runs through everybody's your projects.
It's ridiculous.
I believe a river runs through it. Is overtly being connected. So I will try to do justice to the
dry river.
And for the cover slide here, I have chosen an engineer's perspective on understanding water. And blueprint that you're going to see a whole variety of different maps today, but this is the one that's really an unabashed engineer's perspective. In Western agriculture, population demographics and water distribution rarely cooperated with one another. Colorado presents a very clear case in point. 80% of the state's natural water supply originates west of the continental divide, yet 80% of the state's residents today live east of it. And you can see there the acre-feet that heads west of the divide and the acre-feet that heads east of it, approximately a 4 to 5 to 1 ratio. 80% cultivation patterns compound this inequality. From the 1870s forward, agricultural settlers prioritized an area in northeastern Colorado, which historical geographer William Wyckoff has called the Colorado Piedmont, a name that I am going to not unpack deeply for you, but is a convenient name to use, so if you don't mind, I'm going to use that term from this point forward. If you're curious to know about what makes it, please feel free to ask me questions at the end. Despite limited water, Piedmont settlers emphasized thirsty cash crops such as sugar beets, potatoes, and green beans, and other crops. The Piedmont's primary source of surface water is the South Platte River, which more or less is in the center of that green strip that you see there. And it carries a paltry 1.6 million acre-feet of very, and I do emphasize very, widely varying annual flow. From an anthropocentric view, farmers' water needs combined with water's sparse availability to elevate the role of those who are capable of manipulating the water resource. Moving water to a growing agricultural region such as the Piedmont in the early 20th century required an engineering expertise beyond the resources of most of those who were responsible for managing the waterfront. In the 1920s and 1930s, irrigation engineers from Colorado Agricultural College, from the USDA's Bureau of Agricultural Engineering, developed techniques for measuring water more effectively, for doing things like shoring up leaky infrastructure, trying to predict annual water flow, and trying to even move water across from one side of the mountains to the other. During this period, no irrigation engineer played a more crucial role than this guy here on the right of the flume. His name was Ralph Harshall. Harshall's work in the 20s and 30s is both a necessary corrective, I believe, to water histories in the American West and a counterpoint to arguments that federal government has exercised an outsized influence in regions. A lot of the literature out there regarding water in the American West during the 20th century emphasizes federal power and federal reclamation projects. I argue instead that the most impacting decisions regarding water, and especially irrigation of water, were made locally by water managers and locally by water engineers. They played a crucial role in determining which projects were built and how the water from those projects was distributed. And when reclamation became involved, local users were far more likely to make the rules on where the water would flow and make the rules on the quantity in which it would flow. back to our protagonists. On a larger level, Ralph Parshall's work in the 1920s and 1930s illustrates as well the limits of technocracy. Like many of his contemporaries working as scientists for various state agencies, Parshall believed that wise and efficient use of natural resources should guide policy-making decisions, and that those with scientific expertise should play an outsized role in directing public policy. Parshall's work brought federal money and state-sponsored expertise into the West, but federal power again was being directed at the local level. On the Piedmont, the only ideology that mattered was more water, and the actors who drove that ideology were primarily a local caste. By 1920, Colorado's Piedmont farmers received their water from one of the most complex water systems in the world, and it supported a lucrative cash crop agriculture. They owned stock in dozens of irrigation companies and were allocated annual water that primarily depended on the size and seniority of their water rights, and of course upon snowpack in that given year. Irrigation companies maintained hundreds of small reservoirs, as the little engineering schematic you saw showed, to corral the spring runoff before it raced downstream. And every ditch and every canal practically was interconnected, enabling well-supplied water users to sell water out of their fully supplied ditches to those who otherwise might risk coming up high and dry. Between 1900 and 1930, Colorado vied with California for the national lead in irrigated acreage, with the Piedmont dominating that area of the state. In 1930, the Piedmont boasted 1.4 million irrigated acres, which was 40% of the state's total. And as you know, where water flowed, so flowed money. For example, the value of water rights for irrigation from just the Cache-la-Poudre, one of the largest tributaries of the South Platte River, averaged $400 apiece in 1880. But in 1917, that same water right was valued at $4,500. But make no mistake, this was not, of course, as we've seen, a land of plentiful water. And as you can see from this, which is a graph of the most lucrative crop on the Piedmont, sugar beets, the difference between 1 acre-foot of water and 2 acre-feet of water was the difference between 6 tons of sugar beet per acre and 15 tons. So possession of that water made a monstrous difference. The Piedmont's sophisticated network of diversions, ditches, and reservoirs masked water's scarcity while precariously propping up productivity and propping up land values. Ralph Parshall was an irrigation engineer at Colorado Agricultural College during the 1920s and the 1930s, and he developed measurement techniques that vastly increased the efficiency of water distribution in the watershed, and as a consequence gave him a platform to influence some of the most important water decisions of his day. Born in 1881 and raised on a Piedmont farm, he graduated from Colorado Agricultural College in Fort Collins in 1899 with a degree in civil engineering. His passion for hydraulics quickly pulled him into the brand new field of irrigation engineering. For comparison, he would have been the next generation of irrigation engineers who followed people like O and me, if you're familiar with him. Upon completion of graduate work at the University of Chicago, Parshall was hired by Colorado Agricultural College as an assistant professor of civil engineering in 1909. He held a joint position in the USDA's Division of Irrigation, which was within the Soils Conservation Service, where he became director of the program in 1918, a post he would hold for the next 30 years. Parshall planned and built Colorado Agricultural College's hydraulics lab, which you see here, where dams and irrigation structures in the Piedmont and throughout the irrigated West. By the way, I'm incorporating plains when I say West, just for you. Although a lot of the new technology was modeled and tested. With his background in farming and in irrigation engineering, and with his connection to engineers at the state and federal levels, Parshall was equipped to diagnose the weaknesses within the region's irrigated agriculture and trained to develop technical solutions. And I might add, with his farming background, the ability to talk about those things in ways that were relevant to local farmers. Parshall also possessed a faith in technocratic expertise that helps explain his instrumental view of rivers. As a water engineer, Parshall's work drew clean lines between conservation and preservation. When evaluating a river, he was concerned only with its ability to supply water for people in perpetuity. Water unappropriated for human use was, of course, water wasted. This also explains his disdain for a lot of the management practices of the irrigation companies responsible for moving that water, or getting that water to farmers who had water rights. By allowing water to be lost to seepage, poorly measured allocations, ditch-side vegetation that was gulping the passing flow, Parshall believed that water managers were not just incompetent, but they were poor conservationists at the same time. He didn't value river water for its mere existence in the stream, for its support of flora and fauna, or for its ability to create aesthetic beauty, of course. Those were desirable insofar as they supported a resource that could be reused and reused annually. Moreover, as an engineer, his primary interaction with water occurred after it had been drawn from streams, when it flowed through irrigated engineered channels and, of course, into constructed lakes. The value of a watershed was in its ability to deliver water efficiently and in sufficient quantities. Parshall's objective was to make a watershed yield the greatest quantity of usable water. And the highest praise he could deliver to water managers was that they wasted not a single drop of the resource itself. Well, his greatest contribution to water management came from a device that he and his graduate students helped to invent in 1921. Eventually named after him, although not by his choice. It was called the Parshall flume. It revolutionized the measuring of water in canals and in ditches. And it made water, or in theory, it would make water diversion a little more equitable than it had been in the past. As Parshall saw it, accurate measurement presented the most formidable barrier to water management. He argued that fully 25 to 30% of water was unavailable to lesser appropriators, people who had lesser water rights. Because measurement inaccuracies enabled senior appropriators to take a lot more water than their allotted share. The Parshall flume capitalized on the previous work of hydrologists who had determined that there was a unique relationship between the depth of water and its flow. I will not attempt to explain the engineering or algorithms, which I am not capable of explaining, to go along with this diagram. But I think the best way to understand the diagram itself is if you've ever been to a stream, you know that there's places where water sort of pools up, and then usually at the end of the pool it will start to flow quickly again. Parshall and a group of engineers had learned that there was a unique relationship between the ability to make water move quickly, have it pool up, and then slow down, and then again flow again. And then he used that to create the flume itself, which artificially introduces increased flow into these flumes. And then at a certain point, when the fast water met the slow water, you could gauge exactly how much cubic feet was moving past a particular point in time. And that is what this diagram is attempting to show. When fitted in an irrigation ditch, the Parshall flume introduced sufficient depth and flow to accurately measure the quantity. According to tests made by he and his graduate students, the new innovation had an error factor of less than 3% and could make 20% more water available to junior irrigators who were reliant on this particular water source. By 1927, the Parshall flume was being used in Hawaii, Canada, Central and South America, and Africa. Unfortunately, though, few irrigation companies in the Piedmont were rushing to upgrade their aging systems. Why not? The answer is found more in the politics of water than in engineering. Stockholders and irrigation companies received water allocations based on ditch measurements. Since older technology often registered artificially low flows, irrigators were actually receiving more water than the outdated gauges were showing. Installing new Parshall flumes required ditch companies to collect money from stockholders for devices that would likely reduce their allocations. Further, when it came to their most precious resources, resource. Farmers and their irrigation companies didn't wish to invest money on new technology. As current irrigation engineer at Colorado State University, Chris Thornton points out, there's something inherently conservative in ditch companies. They don't want to spend money, and they don't want to mess with their water. As long as they received their water, farmers had little interest in altering the system that delivered that water to them. The failure, though, of Piedmont farmers to quickly integrate the new flumes figured heavily into Parshall's then ensuing crusade for efficiency, but also the specifics of the message that he delivered. From the 1920s to the 1930s, Parshall was a regular guest on Piedmont radio stations. Since he grew up on irrigated farmlands in northern Colorado, he understood how to appeal to his target audience. He argued that accurate water measurement would result in better farmers. He pointed out that too much irrigation could often be just as detrimental to a crop as too little irrigation. He stated that partial flumes would enable farmers to know exactly how much water they were applying to their crops, facilitating better water, or better harvest, and of course more money. Speaking to junior appropriators, which I think were perhaps his primary audience for getting people to embrace the new flumes, he called attention to their stresses over water scarcity, stating that better measurement would result in water security since senior appropriators couldn't take more than they were allotted. He also appealed to the economics of farm labor, arguing that the flows generated by the partial flume made it effectively self-cleaning. And if you've seen a flume in a ditch, they run on almost no slope at all. When you introduce these artificial flows, it could sort of move out the silt and sediment that existed in a lot of flumes. So he argued, low maintenance too. Install my flume. It's cheap, by the way, as well. He also tugged at notions of fairness and logic, arguing, quote, it's just as reasonable to have one's water measured as measuring one's crop for sale. In each broadcast, Parshall played the role of educator, explaining how the flume operated, hoping for converts amongst those who doubted its engineering, because there were some who didn't want to adapt the technology simply because of its sort of newness, the fact that they didn't, despite the fact of its engineering and the fact that it had been proven in his labs, they're still skeptical apart from the fact that apart from it actually being installed in their ditches. Parshall was a champion of technocratic efficiency. The radio offered him the platform to broadcast his ideas. Now, how do we evaluate the success of the flume in its own time? I think we have to use a variety of different metrics to be able to understand it. As an engineer, Parshall has had a great impact. In the long term, the partial flume was a resounding success. In fact, this is an advertisement that I uncovered just a week before the conference. It is still the standard for measuring water in ditches, although with a variety of variations that exist as well. You can find partial flumes on almost every irrigated landscape in America. And Parshall's reputation as a steward of the public good has also grown exponentially because neither he nor Colorado Agricultural College ever attempted to patent the design. It could be reproduced cheaply. A sidelight, he did patent the gauge that measures the water, but not the design of the flumes themselves. However, during his own time and on his own turf, the partial flume was only slowly adopted in the Piedmont, and usually not as a result of his logical and impassioned crusades. In fact, many irrigation companies waited until the 1950s, when crumbling infrastructure and attractive federal loans conspired to push them toward the efficiency that Parshall had been arguing for the last 30 years. The irony here is that it was not federal research, but federal subsidies that convinced them to embrace this technocratic expertise. While Parshall struggled to gain converts for his gospel of efficiency on the Piedmont, he had no trouble finding people who simply wanted more water, which enters into the project that I'm going to look at that sort of plays off of Parshall's work. That project is called the Colorado Big Thompson Project. We'll get to it in a moment. In the tension between technocratic efficiency and local control, all sides agreed that irrigating the arid landscape demanded more water. Nature, politics, and economics conspired in the mid-1930s to resurrect a trans-mountain diversion project that just transcended all previous efforts in scale and scope. Called the Colorado Big Thompson Project, it tapped the Colorado River's headwaters and redirected some of its flow through a tunnel that ran underneath Rocky Mountain National Park. A subject of an entirely different paper, and so a subject I'd be glad to talk to you about how you would move water 3,000 feet below mountains in a national park. Has a whole host of legal and interesting consequences that tap into understanding of places like Hetch Hetchy and San Francisco's watershed, and the ability of Interior to put certain things in initial national park documentation that allow for these projects. Feel free to ask me about that if you like. Based on preliminary estimates, early advocates projected that Colorado Big Thompson water would add 285,000 acre-feet of water to Piedmont agriculture. I'd like you to kind of hold that 300,000 or so acre-feet figure in your head for a moment when we get back to it. This is a closer version of the distribution system. On the left-hand side is the west slope of the wetter side of the mountains, and the lakes that were constructed specifically to hold hundreds of thousands of acre-feet of water, which would then go underneath the park, and then the very sophisticated system of about 18 or 19 reservoirs on the east side of the divide, which collected those water and then that water and distributed into the ditches and canals of farmers and irrigation companies. Farmers, local boosters, government agencies, and Great Western Sugar, the region's agricultural giant, revived the project in 1933 as crop prices plummeted on the Piedmont and drought constricted the region's water supply. In 1934, they convinced the Federal Bureau of Reclamation to conduct engineering studies in advance of the project proposal. Over the next 3 years, support for the project emerged from a whole variety of sources, including all but one member of Colorado's congressional delegation. You haven't guessed if the one person in opposition was the person who lived on the west side. Editors of newspapers in the Piedmont, a majority of elected officials, Great Western Sugar's officials, mutual irrigation companies and their farmers and stockholders, and even academics such as Ralph Parshall supported the project. As Colorado's resident expert on irrigation engineering and a well-respected public figure, Parshall was enlisted by the USDA Bureau of Agricultural Economics and Colorado Agricultural College to conduct the economic benefits report for the Colorado Big Thompson project, which would eventually be submitted through the Bureau of Reclamation to Congress and would be the primary document that would eventually be used to enable approval of CBT. His report was published in January of 1937. Parshall was aware that a massive reclamation project might be viewed as a government handout to wealthy farmers in the midst of the Depression. So his economic report was crafted in such a way as to address many of those concerns. In his report, he characterized the farmers in the Piedmont as, quote, hardy, self-reliant American farmers and townspeople who needed additional water to, quote, stabilize the present economic achievement and make secure the possibilities of future progress. In a nod to popular New Deal programs, Parshall stated that the sufficient water gained from the Colorado Big Thompson project would be the equivalent of Social Security for farmers. And if you're familiar with 1930s Social Security legislation, then that needs no further explanation. Social Security for a group of Americans who weren't necessarily grafted into enacting legislation. Seeking to demonstrate that the CBT was a difference maker, Parshall argued that its greatest value was that its flows would be available late in the growing season, when junior water users often run out of water, and when an additional application of water to high-value crops such as sugar beets and potatoes might make the difference between a modest profit and debt. In financial terms, Parshall stated the irrigation provided $64 million worth of property value to the Piedmont, a region at the time valued at about $200 million. The additional property value resulted in local, state, and federal taxes that could be invested in schools, infrastructure, and economic development. Knowing that a lot of the CBT detractors might argue that, look, the nation is suffering from agricultural overproduction. Why do we want to give more water to a group of people simply to produce more. He turned that argument on its head by claiming that more water would shift agricultural production in the region away from the crops that were currently grown in surplus. Knowing that farmers in low water years turned to crops like wheat, and in high water years they turned to crops like sugar beets, he argued that, look, the United States does not produce sufficient domestic supply of sugar. If they shift their focus towards sugar beets, they'll producing more of a product we don't have enough of, and less of a product we have too much of. Consequently, now this was a tendentious argument in 1937, since sugar beet acreage was based on a quota system, adjusted annually by the Secretary of Agriculture. However, there was some accuracy to Parshall's claims that more water would supply beets, since studies in the 1930s revealed that slightly more water yielded larger quantities of beets. Parshall concluded that more water in the Piedmont resulted in self-reliant, productive Americans who created real economic value. In other words, the CBT was a really good investment. But while he was an unqualified supporter of the project, he left out any mentions of water inefficiency, which was the crusade that was central to his career up until that point, in favor of a narrative that emphasized the region's water needs. Oh, and this is just to get, I'm sorry, I skipped this. This is a slide that shows just how dominant the sugar beet industry was in the region. As you can see from the graphic, between 1900 and 1910, close to 10 different factories were built, and one company, Great Western Sugar, pretty much dominated or created an entire monopoly of the system during that particular time period. That was easily the most lucrative crop. While Parshall was an unqualified supporter of the project, he left out any mention of those water inefficiencies. Until 1935, Parshall had built its engineering career around shoring up the cracks in South Platte's irrigation's infrastructure. His research and advocacy prior to the advent of the CBT emphasized that a watershed was a sealed system, and that the goal of the engineer was to create as much utility as possible within that sealed system. In fact, from the early 1930s, just a few years prior to the project, he generally tried to redirect conversations about trans-mountain diversion, suggesting that it was way, way too expensive, that we could solve the problems through simply creating greater efficiency on the landscape that currently existed. However, by the time the CBT entered broad Piedmont consciousness, Parshall had witnessed the halting progress of his fleet, alongside the failure of mutual irrigation companies to shore up their creaky systems. The CBT promised more water at minimal cost to the local irrigation companies responsible for delivering it, since the region was only required to repay approximately $25 million of the overall cost of a project that was budgeted to cost $150 million. Red flag, $150 million is actually the total cost, not from the story. Further, for water on demand, farmers could pay the new subsidized price for CBT water of $2 per acre foot, less than half of what they paid to acquire on-demand water in an average year otherwise. So for a time, Parshall stopped beating the drum of efficiency and instead preached the gospel of water abundance. Understanding why this project was such a good deal for farmers goes a long way to helping us explain why engineers such as Parshall, farmers, and local water managers should occupy an important space of our understanding of water in the West. Parshall's initial skepticism about large water projects and trans-mountain diversion revolved around the ratio of benefit to expense, and $2 per acre foot was a bargain when compared to what users might pay for water on demand otherwise. In addition, the $25 million price tag, paid over 40 years, was palatable as well. Yet the total cost of the project, when it was finally built out in 1959, were approximately, as I said, $150 million. Consequently, the same farmers, the same irrigation companies, local boosters, and the sugar company, who were primarily responsible for crafting the legislation and pushing for it, and gaining reclamation support, obtained, even in Parshall's view, an overwhelming bargain. But their success, though, was not just in the price. In the process of attaining more water, Piedmont water users gave up none of their autonomy to the federal government. Since its formation in 1902, the Bureau of Reclamation emphasized that its projects were intended to open up new lands for farming and that owing to its ideological emphasis on small farms, farmers should only be able to use or obtain water for a maximum of 160 acres. Of course, there's plentiful literature on ways in which that was abused. Piedmont CBT supporters succeeded in eliminating, on paper though, both of those restrictions. CBT water was intended specifically for a well-developed farming region, a region that already was fully built out. Even though the average farm size was less than 100 acres at the time the CBT was approved, legislation opened the door for successful farmers and agribusiness in the future to consolidate smaller farms into larger ones without concerning themselves with access to sufficient reclamation water. Distribution of CBT water also points to local autonomy over federal power. Reclamation managed all the water coming from point of diversion until it found its way into irrigation company canals. From that point forward, reclamation possessed no power. In other words, as far as the Bureau of Reclamation was concerned, the federal government would have zero impact on the management of Piedmont water. They brought it all there, they crafted the work, they did the engineering, but in terms of how it was moved about on the landscape, it was entirely the decision of the users themselves. And one more irony exists within the volume of water delivered by the CBT. We're at 300,000 acre-foot figure. When Parshall developed his flume in the 1920s, he estimated that it would increase the water available to irrigators by 20%. Based on the South Platte's average annual flow of 1.6 million acre feet, 20% is 320,000 acre feet. When the CBT was finally completed in 1959, 320,000 acre feet is exactly the amount of water that it was capable of delivering on an annual basis. It's hard to write this stuff, it just comes out. The CBT also reminds us of the crucial yet boundary influence of engineers such as Ralph Parshall. While Parshall's work on irrigation with the Bureau of Agricultural Engineering and his deep roots in the Piedmont made him an ideal choice to craft the economic rationale, his influence rarely penetrated the politics or the culture of water management. To a large extent, the same leaky and inefficient water infrastructure remained in place. What held true for the CBT also held true for the flume itself. Despite the clear advantages in water distribution made possible by the flume, its adoption of the Piedmont remained slow. Parshall's greatest influence came when he employed technocratic expertise to provide scaffolding for perceived local needs, and on a timetable, however, that was completely out of his hands. Parshall's flume, the CBT, and the work of the Bureau of Agricultural Economics and Engineering as well suggest that the federal government was ever present in Western places in the first half of the 20th century. But we can't confuse presence with power. When it came to water, the federal government contributed money and expertise that were largely manipulated by local interests. And I think it's important, finally, that we see the perennial value of this issue. It is easy to view the presence of the federal bureaucracy and resource management in the American West, and then to assume that that constitutes federal overreach. When we take time to examine the network of relationships that constitute power in the region, however, then as well as now, I think we will find perhaps some alternative facts that lead us to more nuanced and satisfying conclusions.
Josh Diamond's up. From stubble mulch to no tip.
Before we begin, I also want to thank the organizers, Brian and Kathleen, and graduate students, and all these awesome papers. I've had a really good time the last couple of days, and I'm learning a lot, so it's been fun. There's a lot of crossover, I think, a lot of similarities between Michael's paper and mine, especially maximizing the use of water, conservation being synonymous with development, experts' efforts to persuade lay people to adopt the technology, and often being thwarted in those efforts. So today I'm looking at a technology of stubble mulch, the origins of this conservation technology, one of many of which constitute the broader technology of conservation tillage, which is an extremely transformative conservation technology in the latter third or quarter of the 20th century. So I'm looking at the origins before that period. And it was on the plains that this technology had its earliest and most developed roots. And as we'll see, the plains environment mattered a great deal in the origins of this practice. So in this paper, I'm asking two central questions. How and why did stubble mulching first develop? And second, how did it evolve to the point that by the early 1970s, it was poised to be fully integrated seamlessly into the regime of industrial agriculture that was prevailing on the plains and beyond? The researchers I'm studying here, primarily a couple guys named Frank Dooley and J.C. Russell, they have a strong faith in technology to sustain agriculture on the Great Plains. Like George, I'm taking a broad definition, broad approach to technology here, encompassing not only hardware and equipment, but also the practices and the techniques that hardware and equipment make possible. These researchers believe the technology of stubble mulching would conserve soil and soil moisture, and therefore agriculture, on the semi-arid Great Plains. Indeed, they considered few other approaches beyond technology. Starting in the mid-1930s, researchers built stubble mulching on the foundation of dryland farming. And over the course of 3.5 decades, they strove to make their practice appeal to farmers. In so doing, conservation scientists replicated many of the patterns of industrial agriculture, partnering with private industry, pursuing efficiency in production, and contributing to the process of capitalization that drove many farmers, or many rural Americans out of farming. So between 1938 and 1973, Dooley, Russell, and other researchers, especially at the University of Nebraska, where I'm looking for this paper, these researchers constructed stubble mulching technology as a way to sustain farming on the semi-arid Great Plains. The process by which they did so, however, meant that farming would be sustained only for some. So before I go further, I think it's a good idea to pause and explain just a little bit what stubble mulching is and what Dooley and Russell's goals for it were. Stubble mulching and similar practices of conservation tillage leave crop residues on the surface, as we can see here, rather than plowing them under. We can see the difference compared to what's called clean tillage, right? There's all of the crop residues are picked up or turned under in the harvesting process and in the seedbed preparation process. And that had been the norm for generations. Crop residues such as these helped Dooley and Russell achieve key goals. As they explained in 1940, their principal objective was to adapt agriculture to the aridity of the Great Plains. We cannot increase the amount of rainfall in the region, they said, but it was possible to make more effective use of it. So the process of conserving soil moisture was twofold. First, increase the absorption of water into the soil, and second, prevent the evaporation of water out of the soil. In the process, this also helped conserve soil itself from water and especially wind erosion. Dooley and Russell's V-shaped blade, which I covered in my paper, was instrumental and critical to the system, at least it's in its incipient stages. It allowed for the preparation of a seedbed, which was usually achieved by plowing, without turning under the crop residues. What happens is these blades, they slice underneath the soil surface, cut the roots of weeds, severing them, killing them, while still leaving on the surface crop residues, which function essentially as a protection, a blanket of residues, protective blanket. Thus, when a newspaper editor touted the device in 1940 as a plow to save the plains, this was a misnomer. The V-shaped blade was not a plow, but in fact was designed to render plowing unnecessary. But this title, this headline, did embody the faith that Dooley and Russell placed in this technology to save agriculture on the Great Plains. Now, most accounts of the origins of conservation tillage begin with or feature prominently the iconoclastic Ohio writer, Edward Faulkner. So Ohio, not Great Plains, humid environment. In 1943, Faulkner published his classic Plowman's Folly, which is a diatribe against the moldboard plow. This age-old technology, Faulkner claimed, quote, is the least satisfactory implement for the preparation of land for the production of crops. Put plainly, he argued, quote, plowing is wrong. Now, in Faulkner's story, there was one hero, Faulkner. His self-serving diatribe is problematic for several reasons, particularly because I think it's led historians astray. Based on the idea that conservation tillage was somehow born out of Faulkner's critique of the agricultural establishment as represented in his critique of the plow, some scholars have interpreted the full-throttled embrace of tillage later by the agricultural establishment, especially industry. They've interpreted this as a somehow fall from grace, or as industry's tendency, proclivity, to co-opt the countercultural energies of various critiques. A closer examination of the history of stubble mulching, however, challenges this interpretation. It demonstrates that farm equipment and agrochemical industries were very much involved in the development of these technologies. In fact, they represented part of what I call the conservation industrial complex. This concept is the guiding concept of my book project, and it describes the network of public and private parties who throughout much of the 20th century shared interests in the practice, the promotion, and the perpetuation of soil and water conservation. As we'll see, Julian Russell had by the 1940s, and I'm focusing on kind of one line of relationships within this web between federal agencies and industry in the paper today. I touched on others in the paper circuit, but this is really the driving one. Julian Russell had by the 1940s forged with private industry a robust, mutually beneficial relationship oriented around shared interests in the conservation of soil, soil moisture, and corporate profits. A second way this paper challenges this Faulkner-centric narrative is by highlighting the role of the Great Plains environment and the role that the Great Plains environment played in the development of the technology. When Dooley conceived a stubble mulching idea in the mid-1930s, he based it off central concepts in dryland farming. Two parts here are important of dryland farming. First, dryland farming involves summer fallow or black fallow, which was essentially 12 to 15 months after harvesting, the land would lie fallow in order to recharge soil moisture. Second, it involved what was called dust mulch. And Mary Hargreaves has the best books on this, so I'm not going to cover this a whole lot. But dust mulch essentially was a way to regulate capillary action. But capillary action is essentially referring to the process by which soil moisture moves up through the soil profile. So I guess the goal of capillary action, or the goal of dry mulch, was to use an implement, which I'll show an image of in a second, to compact the space deeper in the soil profile to allow more soil moisture to rise up in the soil profile, but leave the top part fluffy, a dust mulch, so that the space between the pores wouldn't allow as much water to rise up and then be evaporated in the semi-arid environment. And here is Hardy Webster Campbell, is the kind of biggest evangelist for dry farming around the turn of the 20th century. Now, so we got two parts, right? We have summer fallow, no crops growing, and we have dust mulch, which is bare soil. As you might imagine, that's problematic on the windy, dry plains. And by the 1920s, plains farmers in the United States and Canada began to realize the chief handicap of dryland farming. It's really susceptible to wind erosion. Farmers and agricultural scientists in the US and Canada began experimenting with ways to keep more crop residues on the surface. And yet, throughout the process of dryland farming, they had to cultivate several times a year in order to either kill weeds, or once it rained, that stubble mulch, or that dust mulch is compacted, and they had to restore the kind of condition, the fluffy condition to it. But in the process of doing that, they struggled to keep the crop residues on the surface throughout the entire period of the fallow. In 1935, Charles S. Noble, who owned thousands of acres of land near Lethbridge, Alberta, developed an implement that he soon began marketing as the Noble blade. It's somewhat different from the V-shaped sweeps that we saw earlier that Dooley and Russell would soon devise, but they performed the same function. They cultivated the soil, prepared the seedbed while leaving surface residues on top of the soil. Within a few years, Charles Noble was manufacturing his namesake blade for the market. He also kept in regular contact with Dooley, with Russell, and with others in the USDA. They offered mutual encouragement. They monitored each other's developments. They traded information on specs and design modifications. And as early as 1938, Noble sold a sizable share of his output to the U.S. Soil Conservation Service. Thus, when Frank Dooley and J.C. Russell began their experiments in 1938, they didn't start from scratch. As the Lincoln Star described it in 1939, stubble mulching represented a new dryland farming system. It sought the same ends as the incumbent dryland agriculture, but through different means. Stubble replaces dust as mulch, and the V-shaped blade, the V-shaped sweeps, replace somewhat similar dryland farming implements. Further, the close relationship that Charles Noble maintains with Dooley, Russell, and others in the USDA reveals how the cozy public-private partnerships that became a hallmark of the conservation industrial complex were present in the earliest stages of conservation tillage. Now, Frank Dooley was the main driver behind the experiments that he and J.C. Russell began at the University of Nebraska. It's still unclear to me when and how this idea precisely originated, but it seems to be sometime in 1936 when he was the director of research for the Northern Great Plains region of the Soil Conservation Service. In a draft research program in May of 1936, he laid out many of the principles that became the pillars of stubble mulching. In 1937, he moved to the University of Nebraska as his headquarters. In 1938, he and J.C. Russell began their experiments. Dooley placed tremendous faith in research and technology to solve the problems and sustain agriculture on the plains. He found, quote, no solution in arguments that some land in the western part of the region should never have been broken out and thus ought to be retired. As he saw it, quote, the people who broke it out thought it would pay. The solution was to prove them right, to develop and apply new techniques and technologies that could restore profitability. Now, early findings from Dooley and Russell's experiments were promising. Their primary question that first year was whether soil moisture conservation was best achieved when you left soil residues on the surface, whether you plowed them in just a little bit, or whether you buried them entirely. And as these suggest, these early fraction of the early results suggest, the verdict was overwhelmingly in favor of keeping residues on the surface. It retained by far the most moisture, and it resulted in the highest yields. But he and Russell also stressed that even without the increased yields, this practice was justified alone simply through erosion control. And keep that in mind, this is late 1930s. By the 1960s, increasingly erosion control has become secondary. Efficiency and production become dominant. Despite early skepticism among farmers, the popularity of stubble mulching climbed in the 1940s. The Lincoln Star reported after a farm day at the University of Nebraska in 1939 that many farmers, quote, appeared skeptical with the prevailing attitude that stubble mulching is a swell idea if it will work. But within a few years, this uncertainty was beginning to erode. And farmers took up stubble mulching for a variety of reasons. Dooley claims some just had nothing to lose even if it didn't work. Others claimed savings in time and operation costs, especially farmers of larger acreages. And Dooley pointed to another metric of the technology's growing popularity. Between 1939 and 1941, an estimated 1,500 implements were made or sold in the Great Plains for stubble mulching. Clearly, demand for this technology was on the rise, and that meant a hungry market. Farm equipment manufacturers, big and small, proved eager to capitalize on Dooley and Russell's publicly funded experiments. In 1941, Dooley noted that, quote, distinct progress made by private industry in the development of stubble mulching equipment almost entirely because of their research. In some cases, he even felt that, quote, the commercial phase appears to be developing more rapidly than the research programs would warrant, but there seems to be no way of containing it. Dooley determined in that case the best option was to monitor manufacturers' work and to, quote, point out directly to the designing engineers how to improve. So we're seeing this network coming into form, these relationships coming into form. Raw material shortages during World War II dampened industry's ability, but not its willingness, to collaborate in these experiments. Several companies, including the International Harvester, John Deere, and the Noble Company, introduced new designs during these war years. By 1945, Dooley considered it, quote, very fortunate that manufacturers have always been agreeable and even anxious to loan them equipment for testing. He and Russell reciprocated by reporting on the performance of this equipment, identifying design flaws, and recommending modifications. As the United States emerged from World War II, private manufacturers of conservation equipment benefited directly from public research, and the mutually beneficial relationships at the heart of the conservation industrial complex were in place. This continues throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s. Dooley and Russell enjoyed, in their reports, they're talking about these, quote, implements and improvements really put at our disposal. And in turn, they unquestionably stimulated private markets in these machines. So Dooley took pride in helping to create what the Daily Nebraskan described in 1951 as a multi-million-dollar industry. That might have been somewhat exaggerated. But. This industrial growth was fueled by a growing acceptance of stubble mulching among the public. Public acceptance, in turn, was fueled by conservation researchers communicating to manufacturers how to overcome lingering technical difficulties. So what we're seeing is the 1940s witnessed the construction of a system in which the interests of dryland farmers, government researchers, and private manufacturers were intimately intertwined. Conservation was not somehow separate from industrial agriculture, but inextricably bound up with it. Now, in 1957, the University of Nebraska researchers were embarking on a new set of studies that further aligned stubble mulching with industrial ag. For agricultural engineers, L.W. Hurlbut and Howard D. Witness, the goal was efficiency. They hoped to do for seedbed preparation what the combine had done for harvesting, which is to integrate several steps into one. In the planting stage, Nebraska farmers typically made 6 to 12 passes across each field, including trips to cut and shred crop residue, apply fertilizer, cultivate anywhere from 2 to 7 times, plant, apply insecticides, and so on. But by cooperating with companies such as John Deere and International Harvester, Hurlbut and Witness worked to cut those 6 to 12 trips down to just a few by creating increasingly elaborate and integrated equipment. Although the engineers predicted several environmental benefits from this system, such as reduced soil erosion and reduced soil compaction, these were secondary advantages. As a 1968 report explained, increased efficiency in crop production is the goal of this project. Hurlbut and Witness's experiments also addressed a final obstacle preventing wider adoption of stubble mulching, which is weeds. Since Dooley and Russell began their experiments in 1938, weed growth presented perhaps the most vexing dilemma for would-be stubble mulchers. In normal plains weather, farmers could control weed growth to a certain extent by using this beast weed. But in wet weather, often weeds, once their roots were cut, would simply shoot downwards right away and keep growing. And for the same reason, this sort of aggressive weed growth prevented the spread of stubble mulching into humid parts of the country, or conservation tillage more generally into humid parts of the country. From the late 1950s through the 1960s, several UNL researchers explored ways to integrate herbicides into a stubble mulching regime. And thereby, they ushered in a new industry into the conservation industrial complex. By the late 1960s, researchers reported, quote, practically 100% effectiveness in weed control. The combination of herbicides and tillage during fallow, a practice they call chemical fallow, again, the lingering ongoing importance of dryland farming. This practice eliminated many thirsty weeds and dramatically increased soil moisture. And in the semi-arid plains, this spoke volumes. Herbicides also proved instrumental to conservation tillage beyond the plains. Most notably, these chemicals made possible the rise of no-till agriculture, the most advanced form of conservation tillage. Under no-till, not even the bee sweeps are used. Herbicides kill all unwanted plant growth. That's the goal. And nary just basically a drill slice is made in the soil surface. Very little disruption to the surface. Now, in the 1960s, this necessary inclusion, right? Herbicides are being built into this conservation practice by necessity. This provided an enticing carrot to agrochemical industry companies. Conservation tillage not only offered chemical manufacturers a chance to expand the market for their product, pretty big carrot in and of itself, but it also presents the industry a chance to greenwash a reputation that had been damaged throughout the 1960s, especially after the publication of Silent Spring. By the early 1970s, for instance, the Dow Chemical Company had launched a campaign in its official magazine, Down to Earth, trying to delegitimize environmentalist critiques of air in 1972. Quote, machines designed to work